So, ladies and gentlemen, it sadly does appear very likely that the United States is in fact very, very close to attacking Syria. Many people actually pointed out the hypocrisy of President Barack Obama giving a speech marking the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's March on Washington Wednesday while simultaneously planning to wage military strikes on Syria, given King's famous anti-military stances. But hypocrisy aside, it does tragically look like the strikes are going to happen. And it's horrible. It's bad news. The truth is there really are no good options in this. There are just some smarter and less horrific options. They're all bad, but there's options that are going to make this much, much worse. So, civil war has been going on in Syria for over 2 years now. Over 100,000 have died. There's tens of thousands in exile. It really is. It is a massive humanitarian crisis. And heck, that's even before the recent chemical attacks that supposedly pushed Obama over the line and towards imminent military action. Now let's get to those chemical attacks for a second here, because there actually is some dispute on where these chemical attacks came from. There's plenty of pictures and video of the results of it. Now, the Obama administration has said that it definitely came from the Assad regime. The regime claims it was rebels who used the chemicals. Russia says it was rebels who used the chemicals. Others say it might be a rogue general in the regime who did it. But the truth is, we actually, at the moment, we do not know for sure who did these chemical attacks. There is some definite logic to saying, not that the Syrian regime wouldn't kill civilians. That's obviously true. They do kill civilians. They've killed quite a few civilians here. They have no real problem with that. But would they be dumb enough to use chemical weapons on them, considering the possible consequences of a U.S. strike, that it might be a dumb strategic move for them? We don't know. The truth is we don't know. The United Nations sent in inspectors who have since been told to leave Syria by the United States, again further signaling that the U.S. intends to strike Syria. And look, Syria is a giant, horrific mess. It is a horrific, brutal, bloody mess. And I firmly believe that it is a mess that will get worse with U.S. military intervention. So right now, it's being reported that the Obama administration is planning supposed surgical airstrikes that would last probably 2 to 7 days or so. The administration has said, quote, that this is not about regime change. So then the question must be asked, if it's not about regime change, then what exactly are these airstrikes going to be for? What are they for? And even more so, what are the potential consequences of our airstrikes? Let's examine a few. So, there's no way, obviously airstrikes are going to kill civilians. No matter what you say, that cruise missiles are super accurate and all that jazz, there is no way that civilians are not going to die by our airstrikes. It's going to happen. So that's bad. You know, killing more civilians is bad. Will airstrikes actually make the situation better for the rebels who are fighting against the regime? The rebels who, by the way, are divided into warring factions among themselves. It's not like there's a clear rebel faction. There are lots of different factions that are going on in Syria right now. It is a major, major mess. But will it even make it better for the rebels? The answer is probably not. A 2012 study actually found that, quote, military interventions in favor of the rebel factions tend to increase government killings of civilians by about 40%, end quote. It doesn't work, is what we're saying here. They don't work. Our interventions do not help. It doesn't actually help anyone. It actually makes, if the reason they're saying they want to go into Syria is because it's a humanitarian reason, the truth, that history shows that military interventions actually make it much worse for civilians. So, again, the Obama administration says it does not want to have regime change, right? But they probably do. They probably do, even though they say they don't. So say hypothetically, even if they don't, airstrikes could theoretically destabilize the regime. And if it does, what happens then? Actually, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, recently told Congress, quote, "Should the regime's institutions collapse in the absence of a viable opposition, we could inadvertently empower extremists or unleash the very chemical weapons we seek to control." End quote. And that should be obvious, right? Look, you shouldn't compare Syria to Iraq. Syria is not Iraq. They are different countries, vastly different situations going on there, right? But just for example, we should think back to what happened in Iraq after we took Saddam Hussein out and left an empty vacuum of power. The fact that further civil war broke out in Iraq and many more people died. If we do take out the regime and there's this vacuum of power, or the people who do seize power in Syria are worse, what happens then? Do we have a responsibility to then, put soldiers on the ground in Syria for security as the warring sides try to figure out who's in charge? Is that a responsibility? If our actions actually help take out the regime? Look, the absolute truth is we have absolutely no idea what would happen in Syria if we strike. We don't know we don't even know what the best case scenario is. The best case scenario that the regime collapses due to our interference. And look, in addition, what would happen in Syria itself and the potential death and destruction and suffering that could be furthered in Syria itself, there are further potential blowbacks and escalations that, in fact, can result from our military attack. In fact, the New York Times reported that if the U.S. airstrikes, Syria might, in fact, attack Israel. A Syrian official said to the Times, quote, "We have strategic weapons and we're capable of responding." End quote. But look, it's not only Syria here. And that's what a lot of people on the left realize, that it's not only Syria. Iran has also threatened to strike Israel if the United States attacks Syria. An Iranian official actually said, quote, "In case of a U.S. military strike against Syria, the flames of outrage of the region's revolutionaries will point toward the Zionist regime." End quote. Folks, this could get bad and escalate really, really quickly. If Iran strikes Israel, or even beyond that, even if Syria strikes Israel, do you think that Israel wouldn't take that as an opportunity to strike Iran? Because Iran is Syria's biggest ally? And if Israel strikes Iran, then the United States would then go to war with Iran. It would happen. There's no way that doesn't happen here. And again, back to the main point, these strikes, they really have no stated objective at the moment, because again, the administration says this is not about regime change. If it's not about regime change, what are the airstrikes for? Just some slap on the wrist that's going to kill more civilians, that will probably inflate tensions and get more rebels killed, more civilians killed? These strikes could be very ugly, and that's horrible, and it's bad. And so the strikes themselves potentially could be tragic and awful and escalate badly, okay? That's one side of this. We're not even talking about the other possible side, that maybe we shouldn't be attacking Syria. Maybe a good way of handling this is to funnel a massive amount of humanitarian aid towards the refugees, food and medicine and whatnot, and actually trying to work on a ceasefire by pressuring Russia, by pressuring China, by pressuring Saudi Arabia to try to get but we're not talking about that, are we? We're not actually talking about trying to do this non-violently and actually helping people who are suffering, because there are people who are suffering here. There are definitely people who are, definitely suffering in Syria. But the strikes, again, are only going to make it worse. It's only going to get worse from that. But so in addition to the strikes themselves, another side of this is how the strikes are actually coming about themselves, how our strikes in our country are actually happening, and how it's getting planned. So A positive note, in my opinion, is that a Reuters poll actually found that only 9% of Americans support military intervention in Syria. Only 9%, which frankly I found very refreshing. I am glad that only 1 out of 10 Americans thinks striking in Syria is a good idea. But that goes to the big question then, that we really need to be asking here. If only 9% of our country supports military strikes in Syria, how the hell is the Obama administration doing it? How are they justifying it? How can they possibly say something that this country clearly does not want, they're going to do anyway? That they're going to do it with little consequence? Especially, for starters, we actually haven't got clearance from the UN Security Council. It's not going to happen, period, because again, China and Russia both oppose our strikes there, and they have veto power when it comes to the Security Council. But so that's not going to happen. We're not going to get clearance from the UN, so it will be illegal. Also, the Obama administration has not gotten congressional approval for the strikes in Syria. Right now, Congress is on recess. They have not called Congress back to actually get approval for these strikes. Kevin Gosztola from Fire Dog Lake actually posted an interview with Barack Obama from when he was running for president in 2008. The Boston Globe asked then candidate Obama, quote, "In what circumstances, if any, would the president have constitutional authority to bomb Iran without seeking a use of force authorization from Congress? Specifically, what about strategic bombing of suspected nuclear sites, a situation that does not involve stopping an imminent threat?" That was the Globe's question to Obama. What was Obama's response to that? What about the constitutional authority, about authorization of force for the president? Here's Obama's answer, quote, "The president does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation." End quote. Does anyone think the situation in Syria is an imminent threat to the United States? Of course it's not. Of course it's not. Hell, even the Obama administration isn't arguing that. They're just going on to say it's a humanitarian crisis. How much have times changed, since 2008, since Obama was a candidate and now he's the president? Why is that pesky congressional authorization necessary, huh? He's the president. He's the president. He doesn't need Congress. He doesn't need Congress, even though it's in the bloody Constitution that only Congress can declare war. And look, some of you may be arguing that, hey, Matt, we actually haven't declared war since World War II. And yes, that is technically true. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War were all not technically wars. If you're someone who wants to make that argument to me, if you seriously want to make that argument to me, I'd say maybe you should first go to Arlington and tell that to all the corpses. Tell that to all the dead people. Tell that to all the dead Iraqis and Afghanis. Tell them that wasn't a war. Tell them it's not a war. Tell the people who are still in Afghanistan that it's not a war. But you might say, Matt, it's not a ground war. It's just airstrikes. Probably. You hope it's just airstrikes, but okay, for the hypothetical, let's say it's just airstrikes, okay? It's just airstrikes. Just imagine for a second if Syria, the nation that we're about to attack, used cruise missiles and drones to, bomb the White House in Washington, D.C., to blow up the Capitol building in D.C., to blow up an airport, to blow up a power factory. If Syria bombed strategic sites in the United States for 2 days, for a week, hell, for 1 day, hell, for one specific site, if Syria took out one site in the United States of America, are you going to tell me with a straight bloody face that wouldn't be an act of war? You know you don't believe that. You can't possibly believe that. We'll be right back.